Tonight, we begin with a development that diplomatic insiders, European officials, and seasoned analysts had feared, predicted, and quietly prepared for. A shift in Washington's stance that unfolded not over months of careful diplomacy, but in a matter of weeks. Weeks that have left Kyiv scrambling for answers. Weeks that have emboldened Moscow's negotiating position. Weeks that have sent shockwaves through the capitals of Europe. What Washington did this week crossed a line that Ukraine had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with defiance, clarity, and an unmistakable message. Ukraine will not be sold out. But the question now, consuming every foreign ministry from Warsaw to Washington, is simple. Why is the United States, Ukraine's most powerful ally, suddenly pressuring Zelenskyy to accept terms that just months ago were considered non-starters? Why now? What changed? And what does it mean for the future of this war? For several months now, there had been signals, not from official White House statements, not from State Department briefings, just signals that Washington was preparing something uncomfortable. The United States has been supportive of Ukraine, yes, but they have been increasingly cautious in their support. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a doctrine of calibrated assistance. But what set off alarm bells in Kyiv this month was that the rhythm went silent. Officials who monitor Washington's diplomatic posture know the indicators. The frequency of high-level calls between Washington and Kyiv, the tone of joint statements following bilateral meetings, the speed of weapons delivery approvals, the sudden absence of strong rhetoric condemning Russian territorial ambitions, all of that went quiet. And whenever Washington goes quiet on Ukraine, it means something is about to get loud. Behind closed doors, conversations between American and Ukrainian officials had taken a different turn. Phrases like realistic outcomes and sustainable peace began appearing in diplomatic cables. Words that, to Ukrainian ears, sounded less like solidarity and more like preparation for compromise. The Zelenskyy administration noticed, European allies noticed, and most importantly, Moscow noticed. Because when the most powerful nation backing Ukraine begins to waver even slightly, Putin doesn't just notice, he exploits. Early this week, diplomatic sources in Brussels detected what they described as a coordinated messaging shift from Washington, including back-channel communications that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of diplomatic channels that the United States only opens when they are signaling something very specific. A policy recalibration, a strategic pivot, or an impending pressure campaign. European officials didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Washington was changing its posture. And when the world's leading superpower shifts its posture on a conflict of this magnitude, every capital on earth pays attention. According to sources familiar with the discussions, American officials had begun privately urging Ukraine to consider territorial concessions as part of any peace framework. Not publicly, that would be politically disastrous, but through quiet diplomatic channels that left no official fingerprints. The message was clear. The current trajectory of the war is unsustainable. Something has to give. For Kyiv, this was more than a policy shift. It was a betrayal of everything they had been promised. Ukrainian officials had been told repeatedly, emphatically, and at the highest levels that the United States would never pressure them into accepting terms that rewarded Russian aggression. And yet here they were, facing exactly that pressure. The response from Ukraine, issued through official and unofficial channels this week, was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Ukrainian officials described Washington's shift as premature, dangerous, and perhaps most importantly, strategically counterproductive. They argued correctly that signaling any willingness to negotiate from a position of weakness would only embolden Putin further. But pressure only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. Within 48 hours of the initial diplomatic signals, Zelenskyy's office released a comprehensive rebuttal of any suggestion that Ukraine would accept territorial concessions. These weren't the usual diplomatic talking points. These were detailed legal and strategic frameworks, arguments that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to resist significant allied pressure. Zelenskyy himself took to international media, making clear that Ukraine's territorial integrity was non-negotiable. He said, in no uncertain terms, that any peace deal that legitimized Russian occupation would not be a peace deal at all. It would be a surrender document dressed up in diplomatic language. This week, multiple European sources confirmed that Ukraine had launched a diplomatic counteroffensive targeting wavering Western allies, including key members of Congress who had recently been briefed on what analysts believe was a carefully orchestrated pressure campaign. Ukraine acted before Washington could build momentum. They reached out to Poland. They reached out to the Baltic states. They reached out to the United Kingdom and Nordic countries. In other words, Ukraine targeted the coalition's pressure points, the allies that would make Washington's pivot politically viable. This is what made the European response so critical. Washington's pressure campaign wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of diplomatic shift that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't alienate their American allies publicly. They didn't engage in counterproductive rhetoric. They built a coalition of European voices that made Washington's position untenable. The message was unmistakable. If Washington wants to pressure Ukraine into accepting Putin's terms, they will have to do it alone. And doing it alone is not something any American administration wants. And here's where the story becomes even more concerning. Analysts now believe that Washington's latest pressure was designed to test the resilience of the Western alliance after months of war fatigue and domestic political distractions. Washington wanted to see whether European allies would quietly accept a reduced American commitment, but instead, the opposite happened. European leaders didn't acquiesce. They pushed back with a unified response that was so immediate, so coordinated, that even the White House noticed. You don't get Washington's attention easily. But this week, Europe did. Foreign policy experts described Washington's shift as strategic repositioning, a way to prepare domestic audiences for a potential change in policy. But Europe proved this week that they remain both committed and capable. Their diplomatic pushback was not only swift, it was calibrated so precisely that it arrived before Washington could build public momentum. That timing matters because it shows sophisticated coordination. It shows that Europe is not a passive recipient of American foreign policy decisions. They are an active participant in shaping them. Poland carried out high-level consultations with Baltic allies, forcing a coordinated statement reaffirming support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. The United Kingdom targeted congressional leaders who had been privately briefed on the American position. Nordic countries operating through EU diplomatic channels reportedly blocked preliminary language that had been softened under American pressure. This wasn't just diplomatic noise. This wasn't just rhetorical posturing. This was alliance management. This was coalition warfare. And coalition warfare is the one thing Washington has struggled to maintain since the early months of the invasion. The message to Washington was clear. You cannot change the terms of this conflict unilaterally. Not anymore. Remember, the Kremlin thought Western unity would fracture within months. They thought economic pressure from energy costs would break European resolve. They thought war fatigue would set in before Russian forces had to retreat. But for 3 years, the exact opposite has happened. European energy independence has accelerated. Western sanctions have remained largely intact. Military support has continued flowing even amid political turbulence. Putin's entire strategy was predicated on the belief that the West would eventually tire and pressure Ukraine into submission. And now, for the first time, that strategy appeared to be working, not because of Russian strength, but because of American impatience. When Putin sees cracks in Western unity, he doesn't negotiate, he escalates. And tonight, for the first time in months, Washington appears to be reassessing. The White House is quiet, too quiet. And when Washington is quiet after a diplomatic setback, it means they are recalculating. Because this week, Washington learned something they should have known all along. Ukraine will not be sold out quietly. Europe will not be ignored. And Putin will not be rewarded for aggression. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is still fighting. the alliance is still holding, and the world is still watching, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.